Hi, this is Carrie with Carrie Concealed in the Active Self-Protection Extra channel. And today we're going to continue our Great Friends Guide to a Good First Experience at the Range. And this will be part 3.
Henry Holsters is one of our trusted holster providers at Active Self-Protection. From the Enigma Easy button to their light-bearing Ember, their ambidextrous Cypher, and their AIWB or IWB Spark and more, they make high-quality holsters for many popular firearms. Go check them out at the link in the description.
It's been a while, but when we talked about part 2 of a Great Friends Guide to a Good Day at the Range, we were talking, actually in part 1, let's review part 1. Part 1, we talked about creating a great first experience so the learner wants to shoot again. We talked about using pre-course surveys that might make it a little bit easier to find out about our students before they come to class so we can tailor instruction for them. And we also talked about creating a learning experience so the learners have a basic cognitive framework that will allow them to organize the learning I expect them to learn. And that also helps them, building this cognitive framework also helps them connect their new learning to any old learning they have. We'll dig into that a little bit deeper in a few minutes. So we build a box so that they can put their learning in it. That's the purpose of the box. And then we talked about the fact that this box and the learning inside of it translates to the application of self-protection. That's the context which all learning for what we're talking about now will go through. And then we had an exercise, cooking and conversating, where we just talked about a way to learn positive muzzle awareness and a way to do that when you're holding a GSO, a gun-shaped object. And we talked about the key performance indicators of holding a GSO, a gun-shaped object, with one hand. And that was, the key performance indicators were thumb, crotch, flip-off finger, and home, which is a tactile location. And I realize that's going to sound really weird if you didn't watch part 1. So I apologize if you didn't watch part 1, but that's a review of what we covered. The reason that this box translates into the application of self-protection is because according to a 2023 Pew Research study, 72% of USA gun owners said that self-protection was protection was their primary reason for owning a gun. And 81% of people that were surveyed said they felt safer owning a gun, whether that's true or not. And then other studies have put that rate of citing protection as the reason for owning a gun closer to 86 or 92%. So for me, most of my students, they say that the reason they're coming to me is because they want to buy a gun because they want to learn how to protect themselves and those they love. So in part 2 of this Great Friends Guide Good Friends Guide to a Great First Range Experience, I talked about the fact that I'm deceiving myself if I believe that lecturing my students is going to help them develop the motor skills they need to be able to effectively use the skills that they'll be learning. And we talked about the fact that it requires practice, actually doing something. When we're teaching motor skills, they need to do something. And we want them to be doing those things in an environment that represents the environment in which they'll be using those skills. Thanks to Active Self-Protection and all the work that Mr. John has done over the years, along with Ms. Steph and Mr. Neil as well, we know what a lot of attacks look like. And so because we know that, we can use that information to inform the training that we're offering. So we also talked about in part 2 that disorganization is the enemy of safety. We talked about being organized in our plan before we go to the range, being organized on the bench that we set up for shooting, whether it's for us or someone else, and then also being organized in our safety brief. And we had some downloads that you could access about the ASP safety brief that we used. And we just talked about that a little bit of thought and prep can remove ounces or pounds for our learners and what they're expected to learn. So today, I thought that it would be nice if in part 3, we dug into the science of learning. What does the science of learning say about learning and how adults learn best? So whether you're taking a friend to a range or whether you're running an entire range line by yourself, where do we typically, I know where I looked, for the how and the what to teach? And where I looked when I was first starting out is I looked at ways that I had been taught and the ways that instructors I had learned from taught the material. But the question then for me became, how do I know with assurance that if I'm teaching in that way, how do I know with assurance that the way I'm teaching is going to be effective? So the question I then began to think of, I come from a teaching and education background. I used to teach junior high and high school for a few years before staying at home with my kids. Then I went on and did some advanced coursework in curriculum design and working with gifted and talented students. And so I wondered, in the firearm and safe handling practices, were we utilizing successful learning principles from the science of learning? The science of learning is something that's been studied by cognitive psychiatrists for hundreds of years. They've been studying how humans actually learn, what is learning, and how do humans learn. So Dr. Lewinsky of Force Science says, we need instructors to be change terrorists, instructors with the science of learning behind them. And we got to hear him say that. Ms. Steph and Mr. John and I got to hear Dr. Lewinsky talk about that in the Advanced Force Specialist course that we took, a 300-hour course we took last year. So how do we measure learning? Well, Force Science explains, and then another resource that I'm going to tell you about, which is called Make It Stick. And they explain that learning is measured by retention and transfer. So what is retention? Retention is what happens at a later date. It's not what I'm doing with my students on the range at that time or what we're talking about. It's at a later date. I'm able to know if somebody's retained something at a later date, not in that very moment. Retention is storing information in our long-term memory and then being able to access it, retrieve it at a later date. And then what is transfer? Well, transfer is being able to apply that acquired information and to be able to apply it at a later date to a novel situation, to a new circumstance, or to apply it in a different way. So transfer really is more than just ordinary learning. It may initially seem like it is, but it's more than just ordinary learning. So adults learn best when they're having a good time and when they're getting answers to their questions. During that during that 300 hour, thank goodness it wasn't 800 hours, although that would have been really cool, but I didn't have 800 hours then to spend on it. But anyway, I digress. All right, during that 300-hour advanced Force Specialist, or Force Science Specialist, Dr. Lewinsky said, no one learns anything unless it's an answer to a question they have. And he doesn't normally speak in absolutes, and when he said no one learns anything, he was doing that in response to a student's question, and he was being very clear about it. And I know he doesn't mean no one learns anything, but for the purposes of what we're talking about, it's nearly impossible to retain and transfer information in this domain when they're not interested in the learning and their attention isn't on the learning. So I agree wholeheartedly with what Dr. Lewinsky said, but I realize that sometimes my learners don't quite know enough to know what question they should even ask. And so when my learners come to me not knowing what questions to ask or not knowing what their questions are, I don't say, do you know what your questions are? I can just tell if they're not asking questions. Then I may ask, have you ever wondered how to pick up a pistol? This is in a basic course, a very beginning course. Or I might say, is ammunition dangerous in a fire? Like if you have ammunition stored at your house and there's a fire at your house or a neighbor's house and they have ammunition stored, is that dangerous? Or questions like, would it be advantageous to you? This is the question I ask at the beginning of each sniper pistol student course. Would it be advantageous to you to have a roadmap to a precision shot on demand in a critical incident like Eli Dickens faced? And then, is it dangerous to put a cartridge of ammunition in the magazine backwards? So these are just examples of some of the questions I asked. That question about, is it dangerous to put ammunition in the cartridge, or a cartridge of ammunition in a magazine backward, came because, I won't say which gun manufacturer, but years ago, a major gun manufacturer, the photographer accidentally wasn't a gun person, they accidentally put a cartridge of ammunition in the magazine backward, and that picture is what made it to the cover of the product catalog for SHOT Show that year. And those are expensive. I saw one on eBay not that long ago that was $300 for a product catalog for that company. But anyway, so I like to help my students ask questions if they don't come to me with them. The science of learning says that we must provide students with the context for the information that I want them to learn. And that's one of the things I love about questions, is the question often by itself is the context and provides that context automatically. What's the context? Often the context is the why, or the how, why am I using this? Why am I learning this? Why is this an important skill to learn? So studies from cognitive psychologists, I mentioned that they've been studying it for a long time, and there's hundreds of studies that talk about the vital role of a learner's errors and struggles, or their mistakes and struggles in the learning process, and the vital role of that. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is I need to help my students reframe the way they look at mistakes and errors. And I don't want to intentionally induce an error or trick a student into making a mistake. That's not what this is about. This is about genuine errors and mistakes when they're learning these physical skills. And so I'm not trying to trick them or trap them, but most adults, and kids too, honestly, feel like making mistakes and errors is a bad thing, and it's not a good thing. When all of the learning science tells us that mistakes and errors are critical to us grasping these concepts. And I actually, at the end, I'll share with you, and there will be a link down below to a PDF that just has, 4 or 5 different links on it that will help you dig deeper into the science of learning if you want to. Not that deep, to be quite honest, but deep enough to get your feet wet. And if you want to learn more, you can dig even deeper. But I don't want to artificially create error for my learners, but I want to when my students do make an error, I want to take the time to understand why. I want to understand what decisions or what thought processes were behind the student making that error, that decision. And doing that in a way that isn't intrusive or uncomfortable, I think takes a little bit of finesse. And I think it takes a lot of trust. Jeff Johnsgaard of On Purpose Training, he's also a force science instructor. He says that, direct quote, he says, "Trust is a currency I have as a trainer. We need our students' vulnerability and trust because without it, they'll catastrophize. And what that means is students, if we don't have their trust and if they're not able to be vulnerable with us, often they'll think the worst or they'll jump to the worst conclusion, which we all just do as humans, when we don't feel like we're in a safe environment to explore our errors. And so mistakes and errors are crucial to the learning process because with the right frame of understanding, we can turn those mistakes into skills. And I like to start out in classes talking about that. Hey, if you make a mistake, let's celebrate that. Let's learn from that. And maybe sometimes even the students will come, they'll tell me they made a mistake, and sometimes they'll even tell me how they fixed it. And they'll say, and I'll ask, do you think that'd be beneficial for the rest of the students to hear? Sometimes they say yes, and sometimes they say no. And when they say yes, and I agree with them, I'm like, hey, let's share that if you're willing to. And we briefly share it, and then we all can learn from someone else's mistake. So it's just important that we learn as instructors that we're gonna likely have to reframe our students' understanding of the role of mistakes and errors. Especially, I've seen in the firearms training space, students will do anything to avoid making an error or mistake, and I felt that way myself. In another video, we'll talk about why that might happen, but so that my learners will learn from their mistakes and have the desire to even learn from their mistakes, it's important to me that I create a non-punitive learning environment where we can address errors from a learning perspective, not from a, oh my gosh, you screwed up perspective, or you're awful perspective, but where we can address errors from a non-punitive learning perspective. And I think as instructors, that's important for us also, because when we make mistakes as instructors, if we can learn from our mistakes, then it helps us. And I even think talking about those mistakes with our students sometimes is beneficial as well. So I want to create a range environment as an instructor because I want to use the science of learning, and I want to understand the role of mistakes and errors in spaced practice and effortful retrieval and forgetting fosters learning and all those things that we'll talk about in another video. But I want to create a range environment that fosters curiosity, candor, and fellowship, where people don't just feel that they belong there, but they know they belong there. I want my students to know without question that they belong there with me and that they're welcome there. And having that safety and reassurance, I think, at least I've seen in my learners, is one of the first steps to them being able to be fully and completely vulnerable. One more principle of the science of learning is utilizing storytelling in our teaching. And I referenced it 3 times, this will be the 3rd time now, at the advanced science course that we took last year, Dr. Gary Klein, we got to listen to, he interacted with us for like an hour and a half and did the class, and we were able to ask him questions, which was amazing. And one of the things that Dr. Klein explained, and Dr. Klein worked with Daniel Kahneman. Kahneman wrote Thinking Fast and Slow, if you're familiar with that. But Dr. Gary Klein is a phenomenal researcher and an expert. And he says that utilizing storytelling is in alignment with the science of learning, and that it's of paramount importance to use it for the best retention and transfer. So in another video, I think it'd be interesting if we just explored the idea of storytelling. How can we use that in the best way as trainers and just in our life in general? Because we've all had experiences where storytelling, that we were like the victim of storytelling. I don't want to use the term victim lightly, but that's probably not a good word. But anyway, you can imagine what I mean by that, where sometimes someone's telling a story and telling a story and telling a story and telling a story, and the story has not a lot of bearing, or maybe it does have a lot of bearing on it, but you're not able to see, or I'm not able to see the tie. But storytelling can be valuable, and Dr. Gary Klein talks about shadowboxing and the importance of using that. You can look that up if you want to, but we'll talk about that in another video also. So this part 3 was about the science of learning, and there's a little PDF that you'll be able to download. And in it, there is a link to the book called Make It Stick, and that's a great deep dive into, not super deep, but deep dive into the science of successful learning. And there's also a research article by a guy named Will Thalheimer, who is a PhD, and it's called The Decisive Dozen. And he spent about 15 years and read 200 articles about what makes learning work and stick. And then there's also some stuff on from a website, that's a loud car, called retrievalpractice.org. And then there's also one that I thought was really interesting. It's about the danger of fluent lectures, and how lectures from a really well-rounded or well-composed trainer, instructor, professor, can actually give learners a false sense of learning. And I just think it's fascinating how, and in my experience, lecture is often a very utilized method in the firearm training space. And sometimes it is a good way to deliver material, but sometimes there are other ways we can do it. So thanks for joining us for part 3 of A Good Friend's Guide to a Great Range Experience, and we look forward to seeing you back for part 4. Thank you.